So, yeah. Maybe we don't want this. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new seminar on Ecology and Evolution of Montpellier. So for those of you who are online, as usual, it's in webinar mode. So your mics are switched off and you can't speak. But if you have questions to our speakers today, you can ask your questions using the Q&A tab, and we will allow you to ask your questions by switching on your mics after the presentation. And now I give the floor to Olivier to introduce today's speaker.
Good morning, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to welcome John today. So John is a professor at the University of Guelph. How do you pronounce it? Guelph. So you have to pronounce the U. Guelph. He's a research ecologist he's been a research ecologist for 25 years now, and he's an executive director of the Biodiversity Institute of Ontario. And his work is consists in trying to understand the consumer resource dynamics and how changes in the environment and the behavior of animals change that dynamic. And in his lab, John is working with many collaborators on these interactions at various scales in time and space, and also with a range of approaches. That's what I find very interesting. Well, among other things, he's working in the field, but also in the lab with microcosms. So it's kind of a very complete, exhaustive approach, I think. And well, we met back in 2015.
Yeah, a few years ago.
Yeah, in Norway. And now John is back he'll be back in Montpellier from time to time because he's part of a CSAD group, and on small carnivores and the impact of human activities and perturbations on the populations of small carnivores. So he'll be back in Montpellier from time to time, twice a year. Hopefully. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to meet with him. And he'll be at CEF next week on Monday. So if you want to meet with him at some stage, there are opportunities. Okay? Enjoy. I'm sure you will enjoy the talk and have a great time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, it's great to be here. I have to say it's you know, I've met so many of you over the years in various meetings. It's really wonderful to arrive here. And thank you very much for the work it took to organize this, especially Bruno. You have no idea how complicated it is to hook up one computer to the system. I mean, it's remarkable that you can do this. So this is going to be, if you believe in equilibria, this is going to put the system to a test. We'll see if we collapse into something completely crazy in minutes, but maybe not. So today, given the interest of the CSEP group, which is really about how to better link what we know about the energetics of animals with their long-time viability, especially in environments where you have a strong footprint from humankind. What I thought I would talk to you about is some work that we've done with caribou in Ontario, a part of Canada that I live in, that has much of the same flavor, the same orientation. And really, the question that we're asking in large parts of Canada, but particularly in where I live, is what's driving the slow collapse and range retraction of caribou across this vast landscape. And it's happening in almost every province in Canada. And the picture you can see on your screen shows what the range of caribou was in 1880. The yellow shading at the bottom is my home university. And at that time, we could have gone out on the campus had it existed, and we would have seen caribou, maybe not in great numbers, but they did exist in that part of the landscape. Well, now the range of caribou has retreated quite considerably and is approaching James Bay, the large water body at the top. So it's really disappearing from our landscape almost entirely. And so obviously this is a question of some conservation concern. And so I was asked to join with a large group of scientists to try and arrive at a really fast analysis of the root cause of the problem and to help identify a solution. So it was kind of a unique situation. It wasn't a part of a 20-year plan, where every 3 years I would renew my grants and gradually acquire knowledge. Instead, this was a bit like a campaign, a military campaign, to try and learn as much as possible about the fitness of caribou from several different vantage points, with the idea of formulating a management plan to reverse this long-term decline. So very practical orientation, but it's organized around this notion of fitness on a landscape. And for many of you, I'm sure that's an interesting problem, okay? How do we actually analyze what is the aggregate fitness of a population across a landscape where you have lots of heterogeneity? And the motivating question that we're working from is a hypothesis that was suggested by a good friend of mine, Bob Holt, many decades ago now, but that has fueled much research in the interim, that competition between organisms doesn't always have to relate to the resources that they share, but rather you can have an apparent form of competition because of a shared predator whose impact in the presence of your competitor can reduce your fitness. And this is really the bycatch problem. If you think of fisheries, where fishermen out in the Mediterranean may be interested in capturing tuna, but when they set their nets, they catch a whole bunch of other things just by chance. And that's apparent competition. You're reducing the fitness of those individuals. Even though that's not your intended prey, those individuals can suffer because of the abundance of the target prey. And so when you have a situation where the landscape is changed by people so that it favors your apparent competitor, so in this case, the apparent competitor is the moose, the organism in the left-hand cartoon, then increasing the abundance of moose leads to a subsidy that increases the abundance of the predator, and as a consequence, the bycatch on caribou is enhanced. And so the net impact of that process is that anthropogenic disturbance across the landscape can set off this cascade of events where the apparent competitor is favored, and in this case, caribou are threatened. And there was a fair bit of evidence to suggest that this was part of our scenario, because the disturbance in our landscape in Ontario is forestry. And when you cut down forests in North America, you change the composition so that it favors early successional species that are perfect for moose, and that raises the density of moose in a way that we think could go along with this process. So the intent of our group, and it was a group of 15 or 20 different scientists in government, in universities, and in NGOs, was to put together field data that relate to habitat use, distribution, demography, and movement of caribou in relation to a landscape that's composed of habitats that are used by moose and wolves, but the full range of landscape areas that might not be used, and trying to come to an understanding of how that shaped the fitness of caribou. Now, that fitness we would use as part of a spatially explicit population viability analysis with the intent of having an aggregate measure of long-term persistence, and ultimately, in a science sense, to test the apparent competition hypothesis against the other leading alternative, which was simply that over the past decades, there's been changes in the forest that provide less energy for caribou. But at the end, the intent is to link this information to the next generation management. So at the end of this talk, I will kind of talk about that second generation, because that's now where my lab is at. So we pursued this study in 3 different places. Today, I'm going to talk about 2 study sites that make a very nice contrast. They're indicated by the 2 yellow squares on this map. And the site that's to the northwest, labeled PL, is a site that has received almost no forestry, has very little human footprint. There are some small indigenous communities, but they have a very light presence on the landscape. The other site that's labeled with an N, which refers to a tiny little township called Nakina, has received a great deal of forestry and is very disturbed by forestry activity. So here is a zoomed in shot of those 2 sites, and a number of the features that go along with those landscapes are listed on the side. So you can see that in terms of linear features, there's almost 10 times the density of linear features in the place where humans have been cutting the trees down. The density of moose, the apparent competitor, is doubled across that landscape from rough surveys that we've done. Because the forest has been cut, the frequency of burning has changed, and the composition of the forest has changed. And finally, going along with our apparent competition hypothesis, there was some indication that the density of wolves was higher in the place that's been disturbed. So this becomes our experimental system that we're going to work with. Now, each of those sites is on the order, the squares that I showed you are 25,000 square kilometers. The actual work goes well beyond those borders. So that's a challenge to try and understand ecology at that scale. And the way that we went about doing that was to identify the different forest stands that occur in this landscape. There's about 20 different types of forests that differ as you go from one place to the next. And so much of our effort from the outset was not to study caribou, but rather to study the forest. And so we had a massive amount of work that went into doing work on the ground to measure the abundance of all the different plants that might be eaten by caribou. And at that time, we had really very little idea what they did eat. But comprehensive forest surveys that related the energy availability on the ground for caribou to the habitat type in which they were located. Now, with caribou, a very important plant for them is lichens, and so we pay particular attention to try and understand the dynamics of lichen abundance and its regeneration capacity. Now, because we knew very little about what caribou actually used, however, we also worked very closely with a designer at National Geographic that had designed the original critter cams, and so he came and joined our project, and we created a video camera that attached to GPS radio collars that went on to the 34 different caribou. And so from that, we got a huge library of snippets of the life from a caribou's point of view. So here you have animals that we almost never see. In the course of several years of field research, we we can count the number of times that we've randomly run across them on less than a hand. So this technology suddenly opens up the opportunity to start to see things from their point of view. Now, if you're interested in energetics, that's really important because one of the really hard things is to actually understand that pipeline from the landscape to the animal. And so we were particularly interested in measuring both the energetic costs of moving around the landscape and how animals spent their time, but also how they foraged. And so you can see here with an animal feeding on arboreal lichens, these kind of feeding events, then we can estimate the frequency with which they occur and the time that's devoted to feeding on different types of foods. And the outcome of that was that we had a very comprehensive picture throughout the year of the different dietary items. And for caribou, the bulk of things that they feed throughout the year are mostly lichens, but there's a pretty considerable input from other things like grasses and even mosses that occur at particular times of the year. So taking this information and remembering what we wanted to do, we boiled this down into digestible energy in each of the 20 different landscape types that we have across our system. So now we have a way to load an energetic model to evaluate the fitness surface. And so we take the land cover glasses that are shown with the different colors in this GIS representation, and we project them forward to color them in with energy equivalents. So now we have basically at the order of 100,000 square kilometers, a picture of what the foodscape is for our caribou. Now, we're going to do the same sort of thing to think of other fitness variables that I just showed you with the foodscape. So the idea is now to have these equivalent metrics that occur on the landscape where you color in that map with fitness shaping variables. So the apparent competition hypothesis, of course, relates very strongly to predation. So we're going to now talk a little bit about predation and the use of the landscape by caribou relative to that. So we equipped 170 animals with radio collars and used that to monitor their positions over time. And from that, get a sense of the things that they value. So I've just been talking about energy. So here's a plot of the use versus the availability of digestible energy in each of the different sites, the disturb site at the top and the control site at the bottom. And as you can see, the two sets of distribution sharply diverge. So clearly caribou are clever about finding the places where food exists. And maybe we shouldn't feel too surprised that that's the case. But we now have a picture of how much that it occurs. And so we can actually we can quantify that relationship. And the way that we quantify that relationship is through resource selection functions, so that we turn the likelihood of being in a particular type of landscape into a probability. And so we simply do that for all the different 20 types of landscape variables that we have. Well, the dots here represent the degree of selectivity, that is the degree of preference for caribou for each individual in relation to the digestible biomass. So as you can see, there's a declining relationship. So what that suggests, if we turn it back into biological terms, is if you have lots of energy, you don't really care all that much. Okay, you can live pretty easily almost any place because there's plenty of energy all around you. But when you live in a part of the environment, simply because of the accident of where you were born, where energy is less available, now you care. Now, this is a different perspective than optimal foraging will give you, where we kind of talk about being, kind of much more generalist when you have scarce resources as opposed to the opposites. So it's kind of a different perspective, but it's an animal-based perspective. So clearly that's what they're telling us, is that food matters a lot when you don't have a lot of it, but it's less of a dominant characteristic in this case when food is abundant. Now, the apparent competitor moose we needed to do a great deal of surveys across the same landscapes to look at how they varied across the landscape. And so we linked them to each of the habitat types that I've just described. So the same landscape variables now, we calculate the probability of occurrence of moose in those same landscape variables. And we end up with a landscape in the lower left-hand corner that's very similar to the foodscape landscape. So now we have a landscape of the putative apparent competitor. And we're going to do the same thing for wolves. So we put radio colors on 60 wolves in the areas and track them over time. And we were interested in many different aspects of their behavior. We were interested socially, what the social constraints were on wolves and how they related to the availability of prey. These two panels from the two different study sites depict different wolf packs, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner in the pristine site where there had been very little human activity, the territories are much larger, widely spaced, very little overlap. In the area where you've got disturbance, you have much tighter, territory sizes. They're joining in close proximity, and essentially the entire landscape is covered. So the social side matters here because ultimately what we're interested in is figuring out spatial risk. Now, when we looked at what determined where wolves spent their time, pretty clearly the sizes of the territories was linked very much to the density of their prey. So where there was lots of moose, territory sizes tended to be much smaller, and the density of wolves increased in the areas where there was a high probability of finding prey as well. So prey availability shapes where wolves place their territories, and where they spend their time and to what density they occur is shaped entirely by that preyscape. So we take the movement past of wolves, we use a Brownian bridge method to kind of link their utilization in space. And when we stitch those utilization distributions together, we end up with a spatial distribution in the lower right-hand corner that's analogous to the foodscape that I described and is analogous to the moosescape that I described. So now we're loading up a spatially explicit model, pixel by pixel, with all the fitness variables that we thought that mattered. Okay, well, this diagram simply shows you how the degree of selectivity by wolves was shaped by the variables we thought were important. The panel on the right-hand side is the degree of disturbance in the landscape, and you can see a very strong positive association there. Very strong positive association with the density of moose in the landscape, and a strong negative association with caribou, which is good. I mean, we want to preserve caribou, so there is some spatial separation, is what it suggests, that wolves are not going where the caribou are going necessarily. They're going where moose are, and that's largely in places that are disturbed. So here's a depiction of that stitched together utilization distribution. And so the areas that are green are relatively low probability of use. The areas that are shading into red are very high probabilities of use. And the little grains that look a bit like you spilled pepper on your eggs in the morning is spatial fixes of the caribou. And you can see that kind of goes along with what we just described, that wolves are not locating these centers of activity in the places where the pepper is particularly intense, but rather they tend to be disjunct distributions to some degree. So let's plot those distributions. So here is basically the use by caribou of wolf habitat, and in both the disturbed habitat range and in the undisturbed range. And you can see, it's not an extreme sort of difference in distribution, but clearly the two do differ. And where caribou are tending to prefer sites is a little bit in the sites that are less risky than the sites that are. And as before, we can put a number to that in terms of the selectivity. So here is our avoidance of predation risk. So you can think of this as being kind of the inverse of preference. So this is kind of an inverse preference. It's positively associated with the wolf density, where once again, each point is the value for a single caribou. So what this says is that caribou care a lot about avoiding wolves when there's a lot of wolves. All right, they don't care as much when wolf risk is low. So just like food, all right, you make choices very carefully when you haven't got very much food. You make choices very carefully when there's a high risk of predation. But when neither of them is particularly profound, okay, you can kind of live anywhere, right? It says that organisms are tuned to the fitness variables that might matter. This tension between getting energy but avoiding being eaten. All right, so we'd like to now turn this into an explicit model. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that information that we gathered from field activities, and we're now going to turn it into a video game in a sense that is going to track the trajectories of individual caribou across an artificial landscape. And we can do that thousands of times to evaluate the probability that individuals will survive and evaluate the fitness as a consequence. Now, to do that, the postdoc or the PhD student and then later postdoc that worked with me was Tal Avgar, and Tal Avgar done a lot of very important work subsequently in movement ecology. But his PhD work with me is actually, I think, way more exciting than some of the other things that people are following. But the model that we worked on for this is a cognitive model that takes the two fitness landscapes. On the left, a food scape, on the right, a risk scape. And what we want is to develop a redistribution kernel as a consequence of the weighted responses to those two sets of challenges. And so we do that with what's termed the cognitive algorithm. And the cognitive algorithm is spectacularly scary if you look at it algebraically, but it breaks down into kind of a simple logical sequence. And that is, imagine, okay, if you can, try to stretch yourself to think as a caribou, imagine that you're in the forest, you have a perception range around you. And so what you can see around you, you will evaluate the quality of that environment. That's the cue. So what you can see, you can put a number on. What you can't see falls into the right-hand side of the equation. And the places that are around you might be close to places you've seen before. And so if you have a memory of that neighborhood, you might have an expectation about what's out there based on what you saw the last time you were in the neighborhood. You can't see the resources, but you were in the neighborhood and have a neighborhood notion of what the value of those sites would be. If you've never been in that neighborhood before, then the final term corresponds to what the background expectation would be on your lifetime experience. So if you don't know anything else, you kind of go with a gut feeling of what you've experienced over your entire life. So the cognition is now separating what you can see from what your past experience might have conditioned you to expect from what your background expectation would be. So pretty sophisticated model, but it can be parameterized. I'm going to skip the next two because they basically turn those numbers into probabilities of use. So if we apply this as a video game, the line that you see going across, in this case, a predation landscape, shows you our projection of the movements of animals as they go from each 5-hour time step throughout the day. What you can see, if you were to kind of piece this together, the gestalt that would emerge, I would hope, would be that they're spending most of their time in the yellow bits and relatively little in the red bits. Okay, the red bits are very high risk of predation. The yellow bits are places of relatively low risk. And so our simulated animals are succeeding in reducing risk. And as long as there's energy in these areas, they'll spend a great deal of time in there, like this animal here that's, locally concentrated in search. Now, the thing is it's a heterogeneous environment. And so you can't have safety all the time unless you stay in one location forever. And so the only way you can experience these areas of high energy availability is by traversing risky areas. So if I was doing this talk in New York City, I would be talking about, running across a risky area of the Bronx. And, maybe there's an equivalent in Montpellier, perhaps not, I don't know. But we all know what it's like to be in an environment where risk is high, in some places not so high in others, and how we respond. So I almost have to negotiate that landscape. And so what this model is conditioned on is trying to parameterize what that response was from real individuals that were faced with this task. Okay, well, if we calculate the probabilities of use relative to the forage availability and risk, the top panel is our estimate of the degree of selectivity for places that provide energy. You can see that amongst the animals that we sampled here, a very strong tendency for being good at finding energy. And the values here below 0 imply the opposite for predation, that animals are good at avoiding risk. So here, these are now our beta values that load a random walk model that has all the characteristics of our study animals. So we're well equipped to do an agent-based simulation of what the dynamics would be over time in a heterogeneous landscape. And that heterogeneous landscape now is going to have all the features that we estimated from the field. So just to kind of remind you, PVA has to start with real data that's loaded with real constraints. Then those things go through a quasi-mechanistic process to estimate risk. And from those combinations of realistic estimates, we're going to project an outcome of long-term viability. Okay, well, here's an example. You are never going to see this in this room. I'm sorry, we'd have to black the windows to do it. But it's a simulation of 20 different caribou moving across the real landscape. And I feel like a snake oil salesman. Trust me, the trajectories stay well away from the sites of high risk, which is once again the red areas, and spends most of its time in the blue areas that look like, the bottom of a nice column C. Okay, so when we have these trajectories now, how do we turn it into demography? Well, what we want to do is we now know what the risk is in each of the pixels of the landscape. And what we need to do is turn that into two aspects of demography. We want to figure out probability of death, depending on the trajectory that you explore as you walk throughout the year. And we want to figure out the probability of leaving an offspring behind, which is basically the accumulated energy that you acquire throughout the year. So the game is that you wander around this video surface, you acquire energy, depending on the choices that you make, and you acquire risk depending on the same set of choices. Sometimes the risk is high enough that you don't make it. Sometimes you do. If you do make it, the probability that you leave an offspring is associated with how much energy you got on the way. So that's what's calculated with these equations. So this would be the equivalent of a simple predator-prey model where we have basically a functional response. So this is the per capita risk that goes along with the type 2 functional response that has two different prey, moose and caribou prey. And we combine that with a background risk of mortality, mu. And so 1 minus those two sources of risk then give us a survival probability. And we apply that over the number of time steps that the animal explores throughout the year. That's Jmax. So when we multiply these probabilities, these probabilities of survival every 5 hours over the course of a year, that gives us the expectation of survival for an animal. Okay, well, if the way now we turn into a stochastic kind of process is we now have a probability. That's what this expectation is. It's between 0 and 1. And we then do Monte Carlo simulation where we take random draws to figure out the likelihood that we draw a number that exceeds that expectation or is below the expectation. If it's greater than the expectation, you get a 0, the animal died. If it falls below the expectation, you get a value of 1 and the animal lives. Okay, so the predicted degree of predation risk then that we simulate across our landscape looks like this. Here's a disturbed landscape, predation risk, and for a set of individuals has that distribution. Here's our predicted distribution of risk in the disturbed landscape. You can see it's been shifted to the right. That roughly not all individuals experience a high risk, but the aggregate effect is that there's a higher risk in the disturbed area. Okay, well, as a result, here is the last slide. Sorry, I made a mistake here. This is actually the observed risk that's projected from the trajectories of our 170 animals that we looked at across the 2 landscapes. The projection from our model is that I'll plot it survival instead of mortality. I'm sorry about that, but anyway, survival is higher in the pristine environment than in the disturbed environment, and it goes along pretty well with the 2 projections. I think it's 80 versus 90 in the previous one. Oh yeah, I can do that right here. Okay. I don't have a number on there. Sorry about that. Well, it's pretty close to our observation. So about a 10% increase in risk is what the model predicts. Okay. The survival data from our observed animals, where the survival is 76% versus 90%. So pretty close to our simulated projection after all of piling those things together, because this is not a fitted value. I mean, our earlier distributions are based on a model projection. They're not fixed. So I'm perfectly happy with that. And if we actually plot the mortality rates, so here's a plot of the hazard function in the disturbed environment in red versus the undisturbed environment in black. The solid lines are for predation. So here is the disturbed predation value. It ends up with a value here at about 10%, about 14%. Of death due to other sources of mortality comes in a little bit less than 10%. In the undisturbed environment, both of those values are at least half of that. So, you know, our observations are working pretty well with our projections in this particular case, with overall mortality of 20% in the disturbed environment versus 10% in the undisturbed environment. Okay, now energetics shape the probability of recruitment, and we do that by simply keeping track of the quantity of food that each individual acquires at each step. We sum that over its year, and once again we do a Monte Carlo kind of draw that if the animal gets greater than average energy, then it produces an offspring. Caribou never produce twins to any appreciable degree. And so we now have, once again, a kind of binary sort of outcome, 0s and 1s. So our population model is pretty simple. It's the some combination of individuals that survived a year plus the number of individuals of those that actually had offspring. Okay, if we project that forward, the models produce patterns of simulated growth. And our projection is that in the pristine environment, our lambda should be valued very close to 1, 0.98, and that in the disturbed environment, it should be a value about 10% less. So at this rate, this population would be declining 10% per year. We also used a kind of a stochastic matrix to make a similar projection, just taking the survival of values from the animals in the matrix that we studied. It's a simple matrix over on the left-hand side. It gives us very similar answers, 1.01 and 88%. So our simulation is giving us numbers that are very similar to the projection from the mean survival and recruitment values that we got from the field. So from that, we feel pretty confident that the model is a useful model. It may certainly have flaws, and that none of them is going to give you a perfect projection, but it seems to usefully indicate the difference between two parts of the landscape that we could look at in detail. So the original charge for the 20 people put in charge of this project was then to project that across the province and to say, okay, what do we do next? Okay, that's our best summary of the ecology of this species. And so we take that kind of 5 or 6 year understanding, and we now want to project it across the entire range that caribou occupy in Ontario. And because we colored our map with landscape variables, we can transfer our model any place, because all we need to have the landscape features, so it's transportable into other environments if we have the mean values for each of those landscape sites. So we take land cover classes, and we can turn that into a risk landscape, because we know where wolves are going to go in according to the landscape variable. And so we now have an aggregate kind of map of all of Ontario that we can project. We run through the same sort of mechanics that I just described to project the lambdas. And now we have an estimate for each of the management ranges that the province is in charge of. And the outcome of that is that basically some of those management units are in pretty good shape. They're in the upper left-hand corner here where the projected lambdas are close to 1. Most of them are down here where the projected lambdas are 90% or 80%. So most of that range is projected to be at risk and probably requires something done. There are some sites less so, and these typically are the most northern sites that are farthest out of touch of humankind. So what this kind of tells us, we hope, is that the pronounced gradient of disturbance that humans have left on the landscape leads to increases in moose, increases in wolves, and that because of that, there's an increase in the mortality of caribou that seems to be related to apparent competition largely, but also to some degree to reduced access to food because they're avoiding risky places, despite the fact that caribou are showing kind of facultative movement decisions. Now, the biggest thing is that the current risk that we estimate is sufficient to lead to long-term decline. So there's a prima facie kind of argument that we need to do something. And so that actually has triggered a response. And so the government now has been moving forward to try to mediate the risk that we've just been talking about. So in doing that, this is my last slide. Our next phase of our work is now to take this back to the public and back to government and all the people that have an interest in this kind of argument, and talk about all the alternative policy options that are out there to try and reverse things. But the nice thing about the video game is that when you have a room full of people talking about these issues, you can actually test the proposition that they might favor. So let's say I work for a forest company. Maybe I favor an option that's different from the option that would be favored by a university student living in downtown Toronto. People that live in rural communities have a very different perspective about wolves than people who live in cities. People that hunt things every year have a very different perspective about the value of moose versus caribou. All of those people have a perspective that can be tested, whose ideas can be tested by modifying the model. And so the model becomes a way to have a common framework around which you can have a conversation. And that was always why we did this, not because we felt that the model, we could forecast the future necessarily, but it would allow us to have a conversation where we all start with a common framework. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
You can just repeat the question.
Be happy to. Yeah, no problem. Be happy to do that. As long as you don't ask them in front. In the back.
You didn't mention seasonality. Have you accounted for?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, seasonality, the question was that we didn't account for seasonality per se in the modeling I described. I didn't really describe it, but we did actually to some degree account for that because we had seasonal data on energy. And our movement data are obviously shaped throughout the year too. So there is a seasonality kind of baked into this, but not totally sufficient. And the reason I say that is that the quantity of energy that's in the environment is changing throughout the growing season, obviously, and declining at the end of the growing season as the area is covered with snow. So our next step actually in my lab is to try and capture that dynamic. We have been doing a very similar study with reindeer across Norway, where we applied this kind of model of the entire country. And we think we know how to do that, but now we need to go back in Canada to kind of do that same estimate. On the left.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is based more on my familiarity with reindeer than with woodland caribou. But my understanding is disturbed forests tend to be less good, better habitat for moose, but not so good habitat for caribou because of less arboreal lichen in younger forests, less lichen on the ground. So I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned in the presentation how that plays in the game.
Yep, that was a good question. The question was that for both reindeer and caribou, disturbed habitat where there's been forestry provides less lichen as foods that are obviously crucial throughout a large part of the year. Totally right. I've emphasized the apparent competition here, but you'll remember the mortality rate in our disturbed landscape for non-predation events is also higher. And that's because the energetic gain actually is lower than it could be. They don't get as much energy as they could if they weren't trying to avoid wolves, we think. And so we think that they're caught in a tricky situation where they are trying to get enough energy to succeed and leave an offspring, but not putting themselves in an environment where they'll die in the process. And that is, that's kind of the drama of life, really, at least in the natural world. Yes, in the front.
So I want to know a bit more about why it was specifically caribou that were chosen for such a detailed study. Is it like a very important animal in Canada? Is it a very important animal part of the ecosystem? Is there a biological reason? Is it more of a sentimental reason that caribou was the
Yes, the question is why caribou? Why did we do this? And two reasons, I guess, really. The map of Canada includes vast numbers of resources. And if you have a declining species whose life depends on those declining resources, then it's an imperative of the government to make a decision about land use. And so we chose caribou because they are right in the center of the landscape decisions, right across the country. And currently they are critically endangered. So that means that government legislation would prohibit any kind of economic activity, which for the indigenous communities that live in these areas, that's a pretty big deal. For the forest companies that are also interested in extracting resources, for the mining companies, all of those interests would be threatened if you had a blanket decision that no northern development would happen. By having a study like this, we hope that we can provide a way that we can have a dialogue about how to preserve some places, put less effort into preserving other places in a trade-off that allows wildlife to exist with humans. But it definitely was because this was driven by conservation need, not because of a particular fondness for caribou. Having said that, caribou are very central in indigenous kind of thinking, and they do matter a great deal to many people, not particularly to the scientists that did this study, but the indigenous communities that live in those areas, and to many people that live in more southern areas too. Caribou are emblematic of nature, and that feeling that the losing nature entirely is, you know, something that a lot of people feel threatened by. So in the very back in the middle. Yeah, that's a very perceptive question. And the question back was, you know, wildfires are also an agent of disturbance, very similar to the way that forestry works. And when you remove, you know, the woody cover, obviously that sets in another kind of succession, not necessarily identical to what happens after forestry, but pretty similar. And we haven't looked at that. But that's an obvious next step that should be part of the work, because, you know, any kind of projections about where we're going in the future include probably higher probability of fires. So, you know, it's an excellent suggestion about, you know, yet another phase of research that we should put into play. But the model is pretty equipped for that if we have projections of succession following fire. And that's biologically a pretty complex question, and I'm sure there's people in the room that work on things just like that and would say it's impossible, you know, we'll know in 30 years. And you know, successional patterns are something that are difficult to study, especially in a changing world. Albrecht in the right.
Yeah, it's a question about moose and caribou being competitors. What's the mechanism? They eat the same thing.
No, they don't. So classic competition with exploitation competition would be because you share the same foods. But apparent competition is that you share an enemy.
Okay.
And so they're only competitors because of that shared wolf. If you take away the wolves, caribou and moose probably are quite happy, you know, side by side. I don't know who to go first with. I'll start on the left-hand side.
Thanks. So I was wondering about your scaling up from the movement to the population level.
Yep.
Because that involves reproduction, right? And so if I understood correctly, this currently only depends on how much she weighs. But at the same time, they need to find a mate at some point.
Yep.
And so my question comes from the point of view that does the resource and the risk landscape kind of separate out the individuals so that they actually minimize the mortality risk?
Yep.
And if you actually added mating, you know, you would change the mortality and
the question was that, you know, organisms have to do more than eat and avoid death. Then in between, we have the thrill of reproduction. And that could be compromised by movement. And the model is well equipped to do that because these animals are solitary most of the time. They do form loose groups at some stages of the year, but they're mostly solitary. And particularly females separate and are very solitary during the time that they're producing offspring. And so the probability of not getting together with a mate is a real possibility. We haven't assessed that, but certainly this would be a suitable engine to look at an allele effect that is because of, you know, the spatial proximity. I'm sure there would be a meaningful probability of not encountering a mate that we could estimate, but we haven't done that. Yeah.
You look at the movement of caribou with respect to mass, indirect map on the risk part.
Yep, that's exactly it. Yep.
The map are static. On the caribou are always at the same place, not the risky place. They should be observated, and at the same time, the world, the land risk should go to where the caribou see all everywhere in the same place in the whole world. The map of world should change.
Yeah, to paraphrase your question, it sounds like you're saying, what stops evolution from, you know, shaping the behavior of wolves so they should go where they can get more prey? That would be totally a reasonable proposition, and probably selection should favor that if there was as many caribou as there were or moose, but it's like 100 or 1,000 times different abundances. And so there isn't a very strong selection pressure for getting better at hunting caribou. For a wolf, it would be like going out and occasionally, with the total number of kills we saw, it's about 100-fold difference in the number of carcasses of moose versus caribou. So that would be a very mild selection. And in order to hunt caribou, you have to go away from the places that have moose. And that's probably not a smart decision for a wolf. In the middle.
Yes, yeah. If I look at your last slide.
Oh, yeah. My last slide?
Go ahead. Yeah, on the one before, with the lambda, all your lambda were below 1, so the noise is 1. When you do the simulation for the
Yeah.
So all the population are declining actually, even the ones that are
Yep.
more.
Good point. Yeah. The question was that all the values are less than 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why is that both?
That's a deeper question than I can answer at the end of a seminar. And we all have to look deeper within ourselves to answer that question. You're absolutely right, though. All the values are less than 1. But
Do you have a scenario where we increase the lambda was 1?
yeah, well, we can simulate improvements beyond 1. I mean, so it's not impossible to have a positive growth of caribou, but it seems to be hard to achieve. People are doing things on the ground to try and reverse this decline, and it does seem to take a lot of work. So it's clearly a challenge. So your point is well taken, but I'll leave you to sort out the hope on your own.
Questions on?
Yeah, I think we have to answer Zoom questions here.
There are questions online.
Yeah.
So the first one I have to say, because Sarah is a COVID base. So she was wondering whether there might have some caribou in livestock in this region of Canada. And if so, whether it could have an impact in the interaction of species and thus the model.
So you don't want me to repeat the question. You did they hear? Okay.
Okay.
So this is far enough north in the boreal forest that there's essentially no livestock. So it's not an issue for us. It would be in Norway where you have, sheep that are in the same landscapes as reindeer, but not for us.
So the next question, we can try to have Julio to unmute and then directly. Can you try it, Julio?
Sorry, what? I didn't understand.
Julio is online.
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks for the talk. Great talk. My question was, given the resource used in Canada, like sun, oil, and others, what do you think could be done differently by stakeholders based on your models to preserve better the caribou?
Okay. Well, the kinds of realistic things you could do would be things like you could encourage a harvest of moose if you also encouraged some trapping of wolves. That's a possibility. You could try to encourage a kind of forestry that happens on much larger landscape, so that you change the risk landscape so that it is an animal can live for large parts of its life in a safe environment through its movements, instead of constantly having to cross areas of high risk. So that would be something that you could negotiate, would be the size of the disturbance. You could even make a management decision that you give up places. Some places you just go and extract oil, or you go and mine, and you don't try to preserve nature. But in return, you have other places that you put extra effort into preserving. That's also a human decision that we can make, that we don't try to save everything everywhere, but rather we accept that we will have triage and loss of some places and save others. I think that's actually fairly realistic. I think those are the main ones. Oh, and one other one that is actually important, I haven't talked about it here, is wolves succeed particularly well in places where there's roads. When we go and capture wolves, we actually don't go into pristine forests. We go out and set traps right on the road, you know, and in garbage dumps and places like that. Wolves are, in Canada anyways, the rats of the boreal forest. So if you can decommission roads and take roads out of the landscape, that actually we think could make a big difference. And so we're actually doing quite a bit of work like that right now to try and take roads out of commission. It's expensive and we don't know how effective it is, but I'm involved in some very large projects to do that right now.
We have some question online by Karen. You can talk, Karen.
Okay. Hi, John. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Karen.
Great. Thanks for a great talk. Sorry, I can't be there in person. I was just wondering about the cognition model. And in particular, how maybe this is included in your expected quality part of the equation, but I didn't catch it. I was just wondering how well the caribou can react to sort of short-term weather or climate changes when they're deciding where to move across the landscape, and what this could mean sort of when we want to project things forward. Like, are they reacting simply to what's available at a given time, or can they also say, okay, well, it's raining really heavy. If I hang around this area, I can anticipate that there will be food here next week or something like that?
Okay, so Karen's question is about could we build in some additional features to the model so that animals are sensitive to changing weather conditions? And you could, but one problem with models of this sort is that they're very data hungry. And if you want to calculate the probabilities of use of all those features, when you compress time, you take away the replication that's necessary for estimating the parameter. So the more you ask of the model and the more you truncate the time frame, the greater the uncertainty and the less value the parameter estimates are. So I think that would be unlikely under the circumstances.
So the time scale means that it wouldn't be important even if short time scales.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but no, it's not that it's not important. It's just that we probably can't estimate the parameters. So you probably have to use a different way of analyzing data. But the video callers are a great way to maybe get at that, because you can keep track of the weather very well from the video. And you might be able to parameterize that way as opposed to the large cognitive model fitting. That fitting process is grotesquely challenging. I mean, it takes 20 days to get an estimate of beta parameters and for each of those animals. So a quicker way would be to simply keep track of the weather on the videos and see what animals do from the videos and link their behavior there directly. So I would use a different approach.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yes. Nice to see you.
I wanted to ask, come back to this idea of this map, so you're modeling the habitat selection in caribou and the population dynamics, but they depend on the distribution of moose and wolves who have their own foraging strategies. And so if you start shooting, and you think about the strategy to mitigate start shooting wolves or moose, it might change their distribution quite a lot in some manner. So do we need to model those as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, lots of places wolves would be the concern. I mean, so this is not a prescription about that wolves are I should have called them the rats of the boreal forest. I apologize. Online, online, I'm apologizing. Don't send me any hate mail. Okay, I apologize. Okay. You're right. I mean, obviously, fitting in the other species matters too, and we should need to be doing that. But I guess I suggested that we have an immediate need with a rapidly declining species that probably has to take top priority in our consideration. But a complete discussion has to think about what the implication would be for the wolves and how that might be better balanced by other management choices. When you sit and have that conversation, maybe that's why you have some places where you preserve nature in, with relatively little impact, and you maybe give up and let resource extraction happen in other large areas completely because we can have all the range of natural processes in some parts of the environment and not others. Currently, we have a philosophy of using everything, and that's not, maybe that's not the best way to go about these kind of things. I don't know, but that would be perhaps one way that you can think of kind of keeping the balance across the entire food web, as opposed to singling out a single species. Because you're totally right. There could be all kinds of other negative effects of worrying about caribou to the exclusion of other species. Yes. Go ahead, Nick.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I've got two questions. One that is more logistical. How do you succeed in securing the funding to have 180,000 caribou still on more and more news in such a short time? Because I look at that as a...
Well, okay, the question was, how did we succeed to fund this project? And the reason we were successful, I think, is first of all, there was a serious need. I mean, the federal government was asking every province to have a conservation plan, and we literally knew nothing. 15 years ago, maybe 20 years now, I guess. We literally knew nothing 20 years ago. And so it was a priority. And all of the scientists involved agreed to not try to get funding for small projects. We all agreed we would put everything together. So everything was a team project.
It was funded by research funds.
It was, yeah, I mean, I should actually show you, there is actually a list of the funders at the end. So here we go. There's lots of people that contributed money. And in part it was because we wrote 20 PIs got together. We had a workshop where we said, this is the one thing we need to do instead of having 20 different opinions and 20 little projects, chasing at different aspects. We agreed to have an integrated project. Everyone would fit within the integrated project because we agreed that in the end we had to gather data fast that was coordinated. And so it was kind of one of those rare occasions. That's why I like talking about this. The science is not, there are funner questions in ecology, but I just think this is amazing what you can do if everyone agrees to work collaboratively. And I think it's the only way you can tackle these problems. And I think for me, I feel like it's the way to chase down these. If it matters enough to society, I think that's what we should be trying to do, is work collaboratively, because nobody can do these things on their own.
And the second question is that I read, I think last year, a book that really surprised me was really great, because as large number of ecologists when we came to competition, we thinking of large numbers. And in that book, they assessed the competitive potential of the caterpillar, the caribou that was in Quebec, the left level. And the results were that we were underestimating the competition because there are big outbreaks. I would say I don't remember the name of the file, but you got big outbreaks of these insects, and that increased with climate change, and that it was worsening the future for caribou because the story with the war.
Yeah.
Is it something that is local to Quebec, or is it something that is?
Well, in a way, that's related to the question that Delia asked too. That this is it's a food web. And so there are all kinds of other interactions that are happening in the background and maybe locally affected. That also fits into the longer term picture. We haven't even talked about climate change in this picture, and that's also happening, right? So. Caribou are probably threatened by raising temperatures to some degree because they're a boreal species. So changing snow conditions are happening all the time. So these are wicked problems. But once again, I think you can't give up on a wicked problem. What you need to do is try to use models to try to integrate your knowledge so that you have a common foundation to have a discussion. And if you're not satisfied with that discussion, then use that as an argument to go for other research to fill in alternative hypotheses. I think that is how we should be working with a leading hypothesis that has the weight of evidence, but then always be trying to kind of be open to the possibility that there's other things happening in the system. One last question, please. You guys can fight about it. I don't know.
Okay, no,
Two last questions. Okay.
it's related to this question. I mean, about that it's not, if you have a large scale participation forest, not forest, it's including the habitat for the moose. But isn't it including it even temporarily? Which means that if you have closed canopy, the habitat quality decreases for moose. And so my question is that this, at least at the sort of junction of this period, potentially increase temporarily the pressure on the caribou, because the moose will sort of decline and make some moose move away.
Yeah,
I think that's something which.
So the question is that the forest itself is changing over time, and you're absolutely right. In this study, we haven't projected that. We have done a similar PVA for medium-sized mammals that did work with those sort of projections. You're absolutely right, and that should be woven in. We didn't weave that in this particular case because the time frame for our projections are pretty short.
Yeah.
The last question.
Yeah, good question. Well, first, I was like Mario, very impressed by in 5 years the amount of work you managed.
But now you're not impressed.
It's all about money, so. No, my question is, well, it's about this use of models to have people sitting around the table and discussing stakeholder decision makers, and so you said something about using the model to evaluate the effect of management scenarios, and what we had in our experience, the slight issue we had in this kind of discussion groups is that people wouldn't trust the model at all, and so we had to go through one step of unbuilding the model and rebuild it together with the stakeholder decision makers, and and from there we is it something that you encountered?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because the point we made was that nobody trusts your model. There's a phrase I think that's really interesting, and that is that nobody trusts your model. Everyone trusts your data. And both of them are obviously false. People will use your data and think this is wonderful, and do crazy things. But nobody believes your model regardless. And one way to get around that is to unpack it and then construct it again piece by piece. We haven't had to do that yet because we haven't really been given the opportunity to have the public discussions yet. In part because this is a very sensitive issue. So we've requested, that the next step has to be public consultation. And for the last year, we've been trying to organize those public consultations. And I think they're slowly happening because we have to move on to the next phase of activity. But it takes a long time to get approval for everyone to be in the same room at the same time, because some people don't have any trust at all in other people. And so it's very hard to have a mining company executive and forest company executives in the same room with indigenous community leaders and NGOs, let alone the government. So when we finished this study, I wrote a final report to the government and to all the funders, and they all hated it, which is great, because that's probably the right space. It means that everybody is uncomfortable. And I think that's the proper framework is actually one where everyone is uncomfortable, because it is an uncomfortable situation. Everybody is going to lose a little bit in any of these discussions, and we have to get comfortable with that idea of, trying to find the least pain for everybody, nature included. It's not just us. So. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I will